Hey, it's Chase from On the Table Gaming, and this week we're sitting down with the CMON development manager and a Song of Ice and Fire game designer, Michael Shinall, and lead developer, Fabio Cury, to talk about the newly released Greyjoy combat units, as well as the second Visions in the Flame article, Control, in 2021. Michael and Fabio, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Hey guys, always great to be here, as usual.
Chase, good to talk to you again.
So we're going to get to this Visions of the Flame article, and boy, was that a doozy. But before we do that, let's talk about these Greyjoy combat units that got revealed this past Tuesday. You know, we now have a chance to see the stats and point values for the Ironborn Reavers, the Ironborn Bowmen, the House Harlaw Reapers, and the Greyjoy Ironmakers. These units look fantastic. Is there any particular unit that you're a big fan of?
I'd say that out of all these units, I probably like the Reavers the most, but I usually have that feeling with all the, let's say, backbone units of each army, because they really represent the core design of each army.
And what about the sculpts on those? Those are phenomenal.
Yeah, definitely. I really enjoyed the Greyjoy aesthetic, and I'd say the Ironmakers look really cool, and the House Harlaw Reapers look fantastic as well. I really love their weapons, and yeah.
I mean, you're creating a little bit of a problem here, you realize, right? With each of these units looking so fantastic, like, I think we're going to see a lot of Greyjoy players.
So funny enough, actually, when you mentioned the House Harlaw Reapers and their weapons in particular, back when we released, talked about some of these units back in, it was May. This year has gone by so quickly. Back when we talked about them in May at the CMON Expo, they were actually, I had mentioned a unit that we had to redesign the weapons for based on some of our, continual George Martin feedback. And actually, that was the House Harlaw Reapers, which, by the way, are my favorite designed unit that we have shown so far for the Greyjoys. But their weapon originally was a giant war scythe based on their house sigil. Unfortunately, though, as cool as that initial design was, it was pointed out to us by George and them that scythes were not a wartime weapon. As much as we associate them with like fantasy and stuff, they were a farming instrument. So this would be the equivalent of like, dual wielding spades out in combat. So unfortunately, we had to change those to something a little bit more war fitting, which is where those big bardiches came from. So that's just a little like background to the design process, and how it was one of the very few times that we have received like, well, you're gonna have to make some, I'm not even gonna say major modifications, because frankly, changing the scythe to a bardich is not like the biggest thing in the world. But that's just showing the type of involvement that George and his group has in this, is that when they see something like that, they always give us their feedback. Usually that comes down to specific character traits and things of that nature. Like I've gone on about Arya's nose, I think tons of times over the last 3 years. But this was one of the few times where they had feedback on the weapons. And, that was a change that we made there. But again, the House Harlaw Reapers, I would say, visually are probably my favorite unit, just because we gave them this cool hood design. We went with the original like scythe. Okay, sure, they don't have those, but they've got these really cool, wicked looking bardiches and everything. But really the whole Greyjoy aesthetic, that whole semi-Viking raider, drowned god, approach, it looks really cool. And it, to me, it embodies a lot of the old, I want to say like Conan aesthetic, where if you saw any of his enemies that he fought that were typically like the Cthulhu-esque, there was a lot of inspiration coming from even the Greyjoys and the Drowned God. Those you can still see those, and those are hinted at here with like the Kraken imagery and the squid stuff.
It's just something about like when you look at the sculpts, it definitely evokes that, like it's like a nostalgia for something that I can't quite put my finger on. That I'm just like, like I know I'm gonna have to get these miniatures because they're so great. And this is going to be really interesting because this is the first time we've had a faction drop with so many options right at the start. How do you feel like that might impact the way Greyjoy launches here?
Well, so, we usually before, when we've released a faction, we try to release the starter box. And the ideology behind that was we would have the starter out for about a month or so, and then we would start releasing additional units. That wasn't all just for production reasons. That was also done to like, hey, here's the starter box, let you guys get like kind of acquainted with how this plays, and then we'll give you more stuff. Basically, we didn't want to overwhelm people at initial launch. The thing is that through fan feedback and everything, people have just said, well, we want options at the start. They want to be able to build diverse lists and everything. So when we moved to quarterly releases, this kind of fell in along the lines of that. So when we launch a faction, Greyjoy's being the first one to have this. They come out with their starter box. They come out with their hero box, which players know is the single biggest like game changer for a faction, because it provides the most options and variety of any release. We can release multiple units, which we're doing here, releasing 2 additional units outside the starter box. But those hero boxes are ones that really shake up gameplay, because commanders, they dictate your play style. NCUs change your sub tactics and everything. So releasing with this, kind of this in mind, you're going to have just a ton of different play styles right out of the gate. So, you're not going to have it where you're going to go through this few month span where like Greyjoys are like, oh, well, they do this. Like, for example, when the Night's Watch came out, people associated them with being the healing faction because Jon Snow was the primarily played commander, and his whole thing is healing. Well, even though that's just limited to him versus like Donald Noy, who's defense, or Alistair Thorne, who is about causing negative stat effects to the enemies, those are varying play styles. But when you only have a few options, the faction identity becomes rooted around those options, and that creates a perception issue. So now with the Greyjoys, you can build the Iron Maker, list where you're just a bunch of tanks. You can build the Harlaw list where you're just playing a bunch of, panic damage. You can do a mixed arms list, and that's not even talking about the commanders. You could build Balon, where he's got some nasty tricks and basically is willing to sacrifice any of his own guys to win the game. You can build Euron, who is just about messing with your opponent in just devious ways.
At a cost.
Oh, man. I'm so excited for this faction. It's crazy. And, I think the hype was only going to build here. So it was exciting to see this kind of roll out and the slow teasers that you're putting out there. So far, it's been great. I'm so excited for next week and to see what more is in store for this faction. But simultaneously, each week you guys have been putting out these Visions in the Flames articles. So we are now at our second article. And, before we dive into the topic, if you guys haven't read the Visions in the Flame article, be sure to hop on over and give it a read through. We'll put it in the show notes for the podcast episode. But for those that have, or the people that are kind of reading through as we go here, the main topic was on control in 2021. So addressing control pieces in the game. And you start to address this in the article, and I'd love to hear your thoughts a little bit more. But so when we're talking about control in A Song of Ice and Fire, there's a lot of ways to control things. So what exactly are we talking about when we're looking at control in this instance?
So we usually talk about control, and people imagine shutting off abilities. And just the fact that people straight away imagine that shows us that we need to be a little more creative, I'd say. So we challenged ourselves to not necessarily remove control from the game, but dilute it into many other spread around abilities that might not necessarily by themselves be super, super efficient. But once you start adding them up, then you obtain your control. Your faction should be about control or your play style and not necessarily one single piece. And we also, control does have a lot to do with battlefield positioning, but I'd say that is not the topic of this article.
To get to that in a future date. Was there a particular philosophy you were trying to embody with these changes to control? Or was it just simply a matter of fact that when the game first came out, you had less pieces, and so you could kind of have things that were more definitively it does this one thing really well, better than everything else. And now as the game has grown, you want to kind of have a more variety of pieces.
Well, it really comes down to just an overarching mindset, as Fabio touched on here. When it comes down to, I don't want to say specific elements of control, but more broad levels of control. As we touched on in the article, 2 of the specific pieces that we were dealing with were Varys and Walder, and that was namely because they were accessible to everyone. Those are both elements of control in very specific ways, with Varys controlling the NCU and the tactics board, and Walder controlling unit abilities. Those are both just 2 of the more kind of obvious elements of control. There are other ways to control things, such as via use of tactics cards, controlling, positioning across the battlefield, attack dice, losing abilities is, that's just the most apparent one. It's the one that people tend to remember. And of the elements in the game that cause that, Varys and Walder are the most mainstay ones, partly because they're available to everyone. So this is kind of harkens back to when we were discussing the Flayed Men around this time last year. It was mainly the neutral philosophy of not everyone should have access to this. This should be limited to a specific faction or to a specific commander or something you're having to build around. That was the issue with the Flayed Men. It was not because they were winning every single tournament they entered. In fact, tournament data was showing the opposite. It was more so they were creating two negative play experiences. One, everyone having access to a 2+ save, which was not something that we wanted the overarching design space for everyone to do. And two, it was creating a situation where it was one of those kind of no-think situations. I could take Flademan, and I have a 2+ save. My opponent is going to have to figure out some means of dealing with them. I'm not really having to do anything super smart about it. I just have this piece that my opponent has to find an answer to. And that's kind of the inverse of when it comes to pieces like Walder and Varys, where there is a piece that my opponent, I don't necessarily want to deal with. Instead of having to think tactically or find some actual rewarding solution to figuring out how to beat that, I can just turn it off. And that's not an element we wanted to see in the game, except in some rare situations or when that's actually you're building around that. But essentially, so take the example of Walder. He can turn off a unit's abilities. Well, you're going to turn off a unit's abilities that you find a unit particularly scary. If you can just shut off their abilities, then okay, I don't have to think about that. That it's just done. Boom. Yes, there's some stipulations to setting that with Walder, but essentially it's going how do I fix this problem? Oh, I just make the problem go away. Versus actually having to think, these are the pieces I've chosen in my army. This is the strategy and tactics that I have access to. How do I utilize those to overcome this problem? That is the mindset that we really want players to be, coming into. So if you have an army oh man, here's a unit that has a really, scary set of abilities if I attack them directly. Okay, well, I can just Walder them. That really shouldn't be the foremost thought in your mind. It should be, okay, I'm playing X army. I can get around them via panic damage. I can get around them because I've got faster positioning than them. I can get around them because I've got means of punching through their defense. It should be, these are active choices that I'm making versus just, I'm just going to hit a switch and make them turn off. So those type of elements of hard control that effectively don't require you to think too much about it, those are the type of things we want to tone down. Not to say remove them entirely, but more focus them, because Lannisters, they're a control army. They're going to have control elements. If anyone should have effects that are like the old Walder and Varys, it would be in Lannisters. But that's an active choice you've made. That's how you are dealing with those things. Starks, meanwhile, same problem. They might take an entirely different approach to going about finding the solution to that particular problem piece. But that's built around the faction and the unit and the commanders that they've chosen, not just one piece that can go no.
I'd like to add on top of that, since Michael talked about the Lannisters, that we did choose Varys and Walder on the article specifically because they are the obvious examples, but this was done across the board. So control has been polished in every single faction and every single army. So it will be a thinking choice, such as Michael said.
It's really fascinating what you've done here. This wasn't what I was expecting. So Walder Frey went from kind of being like a binary, on-off thing to now you can only activate Walder if you have no other units that can activate this round. So you basically go with him last. And then when Walder claims a zone, you may replace that zone's effect with the effect of any zone. But if he claims the crown zone, you replace that zone's effect with one enemy becomes weakened, one friendly unit restores 2 wounds, in itself awesome. And then at the start of the next round, you become first player, which is huge. So you can set up some great attacks with that combo. But there's definitely an obvious way to kind of play around this ability. And at the same time, there may be, situations where you are in a pressure point where you can't stop it or you maybe choose not to. But it definitely, I love the way it has this sort of baked in counterplay component. It just seems like you're adding more choice to the game, more choice points.
Yeah, part of the root design of Song of Ice and Fire and its core, let's say, feeling that it should pass is that it is a game that is easy to learn, but it should be very deep and hard to master. So once again, just no-brainer decisions are usually detrimental to that philosophy. So we did try to bring back everything to its roots.
So one of the core dynamics of the game should always be the push and pull of war. You shouldn't always get what you want, and it's all about making those hard decisions and trade-offs. I'm going to get something, but my opponent, I'm going to have to sacrifice something potentially that my opponent can capitalize on. That's really the whole like ebb and flow of the game. Walder is a good example of that, because you're going to get this powerful effect. You know it's going to happen, but your opponent can see it coming a mile away. So they have time to strategize and prepare and potentially counter for that. This is an example of, a very powerful effect with Walder here, but there is counterplay to it because he is coming late to the party. So your opponent has this setup that they can do against him. Same thing with Varys here, for example. Varys is directly as powerful as the opponent is going to let him be at any time. He basically says, oh, you want to get something cool? Well, I'm going to take a little bit of this for myself as well. So, you want to make this big play here and everything. Okay, that's fine. But I'm going to get a little bit for that as well. And, that's really the type of push that we're doing more toward control aspects rather than just hard denial. Control, when we're trying to basically redefine it and move it back to its, original roots here, the idea is not so much of just the word no or you can't. It's, sure, you can do this, but... And that's kind of one of the philosophies behind it. So
it's like the most Shinall thing ever. You can do this, but at a cost.
Listen, I'm getting a little tired of the whole like crossroads devil analogy here. Okay, it's springing up a little too many times, but that's really fitting for this situation here specifically. That's elements of control. It's like actually, if you look at like the Ramsay Bolton Guard sadistic games, that's one of my favorite examples and kind of will fit this mentality. Here you go. Here's two terrible options, but your opponent gets to pick which one of those terrible options. That's a more extreme version, but that's kind of what we're showing here. Is control should be pushing your opponent toward doing what you want them to do, but not necessarily outright forcing them, unless of course you set up a clever play or something where you give them. Oh yeah, you had the choice, but you didn't really have the choice. Those type of plays.
Now, and a lot of times I think people looking at these articles, what you guys are showing here looks amazing, gets people really excited. There are some people that read change is coming and change is scary. They get worried, especially if they've invested in armies that are centered around, control. Should factions, you already talked about Lannisters a little bit, and you mentioned how control is like a core part of their identity. Should Lannister players or people that really focus on control style of play be concerned that the game will be somewhat unrecognizable for their faction? Like, is the core identity going to shift in any significant way that they should maybe be prepared for?
Actually, quite the opposite, I would say here. If you're a Lannister and you want to play Lannisters because you like that intrigue and subterfuge and manipulation and just like, yes, you've fallen for my Machiavellian schemes, things are being pushed more in that direction. Just again, it's less hard, big atomic bomb style, like, I've shut this down. And more of those, sitting those little spider webs out there and everything and just watching someone slowly entangling themselves up into it and everything before now they can't move. You're going to see more of those smaller little elements of control sprinkled throughout things rather than just those big, single moment ones. Like everyone remembers that one game where, you had Varys and he just shut down, 4 tokens, 4 out of 4 rolls, 4 critical plays. No one really remembers remember when he failed all of those rolls and he was entirely useless? No one remembers those games. And so we're basically bringing that to a medium, just like we did with the panic damage change in the 1.5 update. This is about bringing things to a medium. So it's more spread across the entire game. So you're going to see more of it, in just smaller doses, less extremes.
Fabio, would you say that this maybe opens up more room for smaller pieces to maneuver and be used?
That's a very good point, actually. So this will allow players to have smaller and once again, more diluted elements of control in their army, which means that they don't necessarily have to go all in with this playstyle, but it will help players that do decide to go all in, because if you're forcing your opponent to always make hard choices, if they make a couple of consecutive mistakes, that will go more in your favor now, because like Michael said, they're falling into your web. I really like that analogy. So every time you string a piece of web, it really depends on how you're going to catch your opponent, and the opportunity to catch them off guard is greater if they have more elements to be concerned about, rather than Oh, should I use my Walder to shut down his Walder?
So I forget the person's name in the community now, but there was someone who did an absolutely beautiful Varys with little birds, like little actual children tokens to help them keep track of how many order tokens they have. Boy, did a wave of reassurance sweep over us when we saw that it still has 4 order tokens, so that sculpt will still be the same. Did you guys see that miniature by any chance?
Yeah, that was amazing. I'd really like to congratulate the person. I also don't know their name, but shout out to you. Good job. And well, when I saw that, I actually did stop and check the files again just to be sure we had 4 order tokens.
Oh no.
Because I was like, that would be a shame. But luckily, he still has 4 order tokens. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember the same sentiments when I saw that too. I was like, oh, that's really cool. Man, I'm really glad that guy's not going to be disappointed. Because I felt genuinely bad. I'm like, oh man, I remember during our dev cycle when we were like junctioning between 3 and 4 tokens for Varys. So I guess sometimes things just work out.
That was a close call there. It's cool. Kind of hinting on what you just mentioned is that you guys are really present in the community. So while I have you here, I know we're gonna have some more time to talk about future articles. But thank you guys so much for all that you're doing, and that you're out there listening and watching and seeing the cool stuff people are putting out there, and taking note of that. So, just thank you so much for your kind of presence that you have in the community.
Well, I'd like actually to thank everyone from the community that does say a lot of things, and listening is very interesting, actually. So I'd say that I learn a lot from just keeping track of what everyone is saying, people's opinions, positive and negative, and always take all of them into consideration. So I'd say I don't write that much, but I'm always reading.
So, in preparing for this talk, actually, I noticed that at the end of last episode, Michael, you actually dropped a little hint as to the topic of this week's article with that little bird's comment. So you certainly are the master of clues and whispers. So Fabio, I didn't know, do you want to take a shot at dropping a subtle clue for what we might be talking about in the future? Does it make it not subtle if I just call it out?
I was not going to comment at all on that. But I was...
Yeah, Michael, we gotta No, everyone's just reading into everything now, and I was like, people read so much into stuff, and then I was listening. I was like, wait a second, he did do that.
I can say that the next article is going to have a lot of math, like a lot of math.
All right, sweet. There we go. There's our
scariest thing of all.
The scariest thing of all, some math there. Okay, that's a good way. We'll leave it out there for next time. Thank you guys so much for coming on and just chatting and filling us in on some of the thoughts behind your Visions of Flames articles. I know some of these ones coming up are really big ones, but there's a lot to unpack. And I thought this one was really fascinating. It's just so clear in the change, and I think maybe unfortunately some of it was self-evident that the way you're switching things up, it's just adding so much more choice into the game, and it actually is going to make it even more like another layer of nuance and depth that we can kind of recaptivate in it. So I'm really excited to see how these pan out, and what I'm really looking forward to is getting all these changes and then getting my miniatures on the table.